into the timbered valleys of the Northwest, World War II has swept a tidal wave of machine power and men. Clatter of cats and throb of diesel echoes through the bush. New men by the thousand are weaving a chain of roads, airfields, and bridges, cutting their new lines of power and communication through empty forests. War has spurred this new boom in the Northwest. Men who are crowding the camps and bringing a surge of new life to the old gold rush towns of Alaska and the Yukon are the vanguard of a great Allied offensive, driving northward to close with the enemy, Japan. And as the new roads and airways thread through the north, fresh interest lights up the subarctic spaces near the top of the globe, Alaska and northern Canada. For in this vast hinterland, stretching to the polar sea, the world beyond the war will see a new frontier with a rich promise to be won from its empty, unknown spaces. Here in the north are the tiny settlements of Canada's Arctic coast. Here is the tundra, carpeted with green moss in the steady heat of summer. Here are the rock wastes of the Canadian Shield, gouged smooth by ice and sown with huge, shining lakes. Lakes whose names have stirred and challenged the imagination of men. Great Bear, Great Slave, Athabasca. Here are the mighty rivers of the north, the Yukon and Mackenzie, flowing to the polar sea. And here are the mountain chains, the Rockies and the Coast Ranges, curving north to Alaska in soaring glacial splendor. And beyond the ragged craters of the Aleutian Islands, 1,000 miles west, the last half-drowned peaks of America are lost in the mists of Bering Sea. It was from Siberia, across the Bering Sea, that the first traders came to Alaska in the Northwest. They came along the coast for fur. In 80 years of settlement, they never left their coastal ports to travel inland. But in 1864, an expedition set out through the northern wastes to run a telegraph line from San Francisco to Alaska and beyond into Siberia. And the telegraph trail was abandoned only when the new Atlantic cable came ashore in Newfoundland, finally linking Europe with America. Yet even then, 80 years ago, men could guess the potential of the North. In 1867, the United States bought Alaska from the Russian Tsar, in the same year that Canada declared her own new nationhood in the North. The gold rush days came, the wild years of the Caribou and the Klondike, but each time the boom died down, and the Northwest sank back into silence. Along the river valley of the mighty Peace, Canadian settlers before the last World War pushed back the frontier to the northern edge of America's Great Plains. The Peace Country lay 500 miles north of the border, close to the Rocky Mountains. Here, homesteaders proved that life in the north was good, that the northern soil would yield richly in long days of summer. Northward, beyond the Peace, the broad Mackenzie River opened a highway to the Arctic coast. For half a century, foodstuffs and trade goods have traveled down north to all the scattered fur posts along the river. Beyond the reach of easy river travel lay the vast wilderness of Canada's Great Shield, nearly 2 million square miles of stripped and soilless rock. Yet here, from the rocks, came the first beginnings of big-scale modern development in the far north. Rich ore bodies, located by Canadian geologists all through the subarctic, spread a net of promise for prospectors and mining men. From Great Bear Lake, straddling the Arctic Circle in Canada's Northwest Territories, came the first promise of new wealth. Here in 1930, claiming on discoveries reported 30 years before, mining man Gilbert Labine built the famous radium and silver mine of El Dorado. "1,200 miles from railhead, by river and portage and river again, the radium-bearing ores traveled south from Great Bear to the world outside. The new discovery in northern Canada broke a world monopoly in radium, aided modern medicine and science. Men with courage and imagination, making shrewd use of air and water transport in a vast country, began to build the new community of the Canadian North. Near Yellowknife, the growing gold fields of Great Slave Lake in the 1930s brought new hope for permanent towns and lasting roots in the subarctic. By 1939, new mining camps and settlements had driven far into the north, around the great northern lakes and down the Mackenzie. That year, too, Canada mapped out a chain of airfields through the Northwest, a new skyway to link the whole nation with its north and with Alaska just beyond. Deep in the huge forest tracts of the Northwest, Canadian engineers mapped out sites for the new airfields through northern British Columbia and the Yukon. This would be the first great drive to pierce the wall of wilderness that shut off the huge North Pacific region. First came the long, tough job of hauling supplies to the chosen sites. In winter, driving deep into the bush, the tractor trains pushed north from the towns of Peace River. In the spring, freight barges pushed inland from the Pacific coast, following the swollen rivers upstream. They shot white water. They risked the rocks and shallows. They ran their heavy load along the wild eddies of the Stickeen and the Dees in the paths of the Indians and the old explorers. And at the end of the dangerous river run, at tiny fur posts in northern British Columbia, freight for the airfields rolled ashore, and trucks swung it along the tote roads to the new campsites. So the forest gave way before the bite of dozer blades and graders. Log buildings took shape, control towers, radio range stations, machine shops. In 1 year of work, the new Canadian airfields, fully equipped and serviced, spread their pathway for travel and freight through the trackless Northland towards Alaska. Reaching far out into the North Pacific, the towns of Alaska clung to a rugged shore. Old Russian churches recalled the day of Siberian trading posts. This was a land full of natural wealth, 1/5 the size of all the United States. But in it, there were too few settlers to strike into the unknown backcountry and see what promise it held. In contrast were the lean lands to the south, where Depression years and drought had blighted thousands of American farms. So much so that in 1935, 200 families took ship at San Francisco to make a fresh start in new virgin land to the north in Alaska. First to settle the land in Alaskan territory were these new pioneers, first to root deep in fertile soil and found a lasting farm community. And on their Matanuska Valley farms, they proved again that northern soil and sun can yield, that man can make a life in the north as rich and satisfying as in the crowded world outside. But North America is not alone in the growing northward movement of her people, for we share a territory with others who have made long and scientific study of life in the polar regions. Go north beyond the Alaskan tundra, north and west over the drift ice and the ships breaking through the polar sea, and look down on the loneliest land on earth, eastern Siberia, close neighbor to America. Here are the native peoples of the Soviet Arctic, the new communities and camps driving a wedge of settlement into the empty north. Here inside the Arctic Circle, they built new mines, cities, industry. They cut into their immense stands of Siberian larch. They ran their log booms down the rivers, the Lena and the Yenisei, to Arctic seaports. Before the war, nearly 200 ships plied the northern seaway across the top of Asia. Steaming in brave procession, they moved in convoy through the ice, a symbol of the Soviet will to fill the empty Arctic spaces with productive life and work. For North America, the first flare of war in the Pacific lit up the real strategic meaning of the Northwest. Through the fogs of the Aleutian Islands, Japan's advance guard against the West crept ashore unseen in June of 1942. Now from the empty north, the invader menaced not only Alaska, but the very heart of the continent. Two nations sprang to defense, rushing aircraft, ships, material, men into the threatened Northwest. Their job, to build a great base for counterattack against Japan. Transportation was the first hurdle, finding ways to haul the freight for big construction projects now beginning. Canada's new airfields in the Northwest were fully prepared. Under RCAF control, they funneled a steady stream of war transport to Alaska. And from a northern ally, special missions came from Soviet Russia, speeding down the airway to Ottawa and Washington for Allied consultation. Already the airways pointed a path to the future, bridging the space between continents, opening new air routes and new territory for joint development by cooperating neighbor states. From the end of steel in northern Alberta, a vast tonnage of fuel and war supplies had to be rushed to bases in Alaska and to the new Canadian airfields up the line. So the miracle of the Alaska Highway swiftly took shape, bridging with steel great rivers like the Peace and the Liard, carving an inland route through the Northwest, safe from possible attack. In 9 months, traffic was rolling, and a new way north was opened. Following the airfield chain, the highway strengthened the line of contact with bases in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. At the same time, to feed this growing war machine, new oil wells were developed at Norman and the Mackenzie River, and a new refinery took shape at Whitehorse to be linked by pipeline through 600 miles of wilderness still unmapped. From the Norman wells, hugging the Arctic Circle, United States Army officials planned to supply oil direct to the Alaska War Theater, working in cooperation with the Canadian government and with veteran oilmen who had opened the Norman field 20 years before. muskeg menaced the working canal. Frozen subsoil thawing in the sunshine into a sea of mud bogged construction, road building, traffic. But the drills bit down into the frozen soil regardless, and new wells, new producers came in steadily through the feverish months of 1943. But when the precious crude jetted out of the earth, the job had just begun. For the oil must still be carried across the Mackenzie River, and pipe must be laid through the mountains before the crude could be refined for aircraft and warships in the North Pacific. Men from the South, from Turner Valley, California, Oklahoma, Texas, pushed the line forward into country that no man had seen before. All through 1943, work and canal drove forward, overriding the toughest barriers of distance and climate, and opening strange new vistas through a land conceived in the grand scale. All these works have brought sweeping changes into the North. Joint efforts of builders and engineers, massive machine power, have broken down the old barriers of isolation. Today there has grown in the Northwest a mighty network of transport and supply for counterattack against Japan. A 1,000 miles down the Aleutian train, U.S. and Canadian troops streamed ashore at Kiska in August of 1943. A mounting wave of Allied air power from the Canadian Northwest and Alaska had paved the way for recapture of the island outposts. Next would come the long-range bombing raids westward to Paramushiro and beyond, striking directly at the islands of Japan. Joint plans for defense construction, swiftly carried out by Canada and the United States, had beaten back the enemy. And now, in the same spirit of cooperation, both countries prepared their plans for the future of the huge North Pacific region. Today, Canada's Northwest is richer by many a great engineering work rushed into being through pressure of war. A pattern of new roadways, bridges, airfields has thrown open the gates to a whole territory. Here are the great clean spaces of new land, a new frontier to absorb the energies of men and women released from the urgency of war. Here are huge reserves of natural wealth for men with the courage and skill to use them well. Along the coast and in the broad lakes inland are teeming fisheries whose yield goes out to half a world at war. Rising in the hills are new mines, already providing vital metals for the war needs of the United Nations. Along the Athabasca River lies a vast potential oil field, the famous tar sands of Alberta, where for mile on mile pure oil sweats from the sandy riverbanks. To bring out all this wealth, the North needs men, surveyors, prospectors, settlers, farmers, to work the land and make it their own. And many who are building the defenses of Alaska and the Canadian North today, who are seeing the land and learning its ways for the first time, will come to live and work as pioneers of the new North tomorrow. For distance has dwindled, and even the shores of the Arctic Ocean no longer mark the end of the line for man's advance into the North. Across the inland polar sea, over the top of the world, run the shortest airways to Europe and Asia. And now, at the threshold of a new age in the air, the Arctic is no longer back of beyond. It lies in the mainstream of traffic between continents. Northward lies the new world, waiting for men to master its sweep of space and make it yield its rich promise for tomorrow.